to make sure that everybody has a chance to enter the room. But then we can get started talking about science on a sphere. In the meantime, I can introduce myself. My name is Nick VanAcker. I am the Science on a Sphere coordinator here at the MSU Museum. And today we are going to be talking all about World Mosquito Day. So we'll be talking about mosquitoes, we'll be talking about a little bit of mosquito biology, talking about some disease spread, and also what we can do to stop ourselves from being eaten by mosquitoes. So all sorts of good stuff. It looks like our numbers just about leveled off. I think that's fantastic. So again, before we get started, I just want to cover one more thing, and that is the chat box. So I see a lot of new names on here, it looks like, watching on Zoom. And also if you're watching on Facebook, hello, welcome. So if you guys are watching on Zoom, I'm going to be tossing out some questions throughout the program today. You can feel free to answer those questions in the chat box, and I will keep an eye on it there. And if you're watching on Facebook, Stephanie will be keeping an eye on the Facebook comments, and she'll be letting me know all about what you guys are saying on Facebook as well. But with that, we can get started. So for anyone who is just joining us, my name is again Nick VanAcker. I am the Science on a Sphere coordinator here at the MSU Museum. And we are using Science on a Sphere today to talk all about World Mosquito Day. Mosquitoes have been very prevalent this summer. If any of you are watching from Michigan, or I think a lot of areas in the United States, they've been pretty prevalent. So hopefully we'll learn a little bit more about the insects that have been pestering us this summer, and things that we can do to prevent their spread a little bit, and also just appreciate them a little bit more because they are very interesting insects. But before we talk about that, I do want to talk about the big elephant in the room behind me, which is Science on a Sphere. So if you're not familiar, Science on a Sphere is a device that we have at the MSU Museum. It is on our first floor, right off of our lobby. Science on a Sphere is a project that was developed by NOAA, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And we use Science on a Sphere to look at global data sets. So you can see right now we've got the Earth rotating behind me, but we can use Science on a Sphere to look at all sorts of different cool stuff. So that's everything from looking at the Earth to looking at weather and climate patterns. We can look at animal migrations, and we can even go beyond Earth to look at planets, look at stars, look at all sorts of fantastic stuff. Today, we're going to be sticking pretty close to Earth. We're going to be looking at some pretty tiny critters and then expanding out a little bit to look at how those mosquitoes impact the Earth as a whole. But with that, we can get started. And so I'm going to pull up our first data set, which of course is going to be the main subject of our talk today, and that is our friend slash foe, the mosquito. If everyone was in person here, I would ask you to raise your hands. I think you can all raise your hands at home and we'll still get the same result. But I'm curious, you guys can also type in the chat, how many of you have been bitten by a mosquito before? I assume this is going to be 100%. But I see a couple of people have their hands raised in the chat here. But I assume if you're not raising your hands, you still haven't been by a mosquito before. Like you said, you cannot see the video. You should be able to maybe switch around between presenters. We've got a couple of presenters here. But if you switch your view, you might be able to see me a little bit better. But yeah, I see that lots of people have their hands raised. Almost everybody has been bitten by a mosquito in the entire world. Mosquitoes are incredibly widespread. They're found on every single continent except for Antarctica. So if you're looking for a universal experience that really unites humanity, there's lots of different things we could talk about, but I personally think mosquitoes are probably that unifying experience for everyone. Mosquitoes, I think we've all experienced as well. If we're sitting, in the dark of the night, on a summer night, sitting in our backyard or in a park, you hear that buzzing right in your ear. It's one of the most annoying things that you might experience. But I have a question that I'm going to toss out to all of you, again, to just kind of get the juices flowing, get you guys thinking and interacting. When we hear that mosquito buzzing in our ear, that mosquito right up next to us, that mosquito is looking for something. It's looking to drink something very specific. And so if you guys could let me know in the chat, or if you could type it in the Facebook comments, what is that mosquito looking for that is so important to the mosquito? And I see a couple of answers rolling in. And so I'll wait maybe just a second to see, but I see a couple of people have responded that the mosquito is looking for blood. And that is exactly correct. The mosquito is looking for blood. So I'm going to switch the data set behind me here, rotate it around. And this data set on the sphere is showing what the blood of a human looks like. So we've got all sorts of different stuff going on. We've got our red blood cells, we've got our white blood cells, we've got our platelets. And this is the delicious juice that the mosquito is looking for when it's buzzing around our body. The blood inside a human and inside lots of other animals might not sound very appealing to us. It's something that a lot of people have some problems with. But for mosquitoes and for other invertebrates and insects, blood is actually a pretty good food source. And it makes sense if you think about it. So in our bodies, our blood acts as sort of a nutrient highway. It's the way that nutrients, oxygen, and all sorts of great stuff gets transported all around our body. And so for a mosquito or for another blood-sucking animal or insect, being able to tap into that blood and being able to get just a little bit of those nutrients is basically a cheat code for them. They don't have to worry about going out and hunting something. They can just find a big blood source like us or another large animal and get some quick nutrients. But it's important to note that mosquitoes, even though they're famous for drinking blood, don't drink blood exclusively. So I'm actually going to go back to this mosquito picture that I had up a second ago. And this picture, it might be a little bit hard to see. This is from the CDC. This is looking at a picture of I believe it is a male mosquito. And the way that you can tell that it's a male mosquito is because these antennae all the way up at the top right here, you might not be able to tell on the video, but they look almost like feathers. They have little bits that come off the edges of the antenna. And so all male mosquitoes are going to look like that. They have those feathery antennae. And all male mosquitoes do not drink blood. So if you see a mosquito that has those kind of feathery antennae on there, that means it's a male. That also means it's going to leave you alone. That mosquito is not interested in drinking your blood in any way. So that brings up the question, of course, what do male mosquitoes drink? And the answer is that they actually drink a lot of nectar from flowers, and they also drink fruit juice, which is kind of crazy, but it makes sense when you think about it. The way that mosquitoes drink blood is with their proboscis, which is the, if I can point to it on the sphere there, is kind of the long needle-like projection. That's where their nose would be if they were a human, that long needle-like thing that we're all used to seeing. And so it's really good at going through the skin to get the blood, but it's also really good for piercing the sides of fruit or for going into flowers to get nectar. And then they use it like a straw to suck things up. So again, nectar is a liquid, fruit juice is a liquid. They're able to suck it up the exact same way. So male mosquitoes are never going to bite you to drink blood. And in fact, most female mosquitoes aren't going to either under most circumstances. The vast majority of female mosquito diets is also nectar and fruit juice. But female mosquitoes do occasionally need to bite humans to get their blood and bite other animals to get their blood. And it's for a very specific purpose. And so I'm curious if you guys can leave in the chat, the female mosquito is trying to make something when she goes to drink some blood. And so I'm curious if you guys know, what is the mosquito trying to make that she needs that blood meal for? So we'll wait a couple of minutes and see, or a couple of seconds, see what everybody has to say, but I see a couple answers already rolling in that female mosquito is drinking blood for reproduction. That's exactly right. That female mosquito is drinking blood to try and make little baby mosquitoes. She's trying to lay some eggs. So I'm going to pull up another data set here, and this data set is going to show us the mosquito life cycle, which again is probably something we're all pretty familiar with, sort of know your enemy sort of thing. But so we're used to seeing the adult mosquitoes all the way up on the top here. This is a pretty standard mosquito. You can see it's got legs, it's got wings, it's got that long proboscis. It's also a pretty usual stance for the mosquito when we see it perched on our arm or on our leg. So that female mosquito is going to drink a blood meal so that she can have the nutrients and the energy in order to lay eggs. And I'm actually going to add a magnifying glass to the sphere so we can zoom in a little bit. So we've got our adult mosquito up there drinking her blood to lay some eggs. And then the mosquito, after she drinks her blood meal, is going to try and find a pool of water. And the type of water is pretty important for the mosquito. So basically, female mosquitoes are trying to just be a good mama. They want to drink blood so that they have the energy and the nutrients to produce eggs, but they also want to protect those eggs once they've been laid. So they're going to look around for a body of water that's not going to have any predators in it. It's very important. And it's not going to be a flowing body of water, so the eggs don't get washed away. They're going to look for a stagnant body of water. And that could be almost anything. It could be a small pond all the way down to a little bottle cap that has a little bit of rainwater in it. Anything works for them. And so once that mosquito finds that area of stagnant water, she is going to lay her eggs. And after the mosquito lays her eggs, there's a couple of different things that can happen. This whole process can happen pretty quickly. The whole life cycle process takes a little bit over a week. But the cool thing about eggs from mosquitoes and some other insects is that they're actually pretty perfectly packaged. So if they are laid in a dry area, for instance, or they're laid in a wet area that then dries up, those eggs can actually last for a few months before it rains again in order for the eggs to get hydrated and hatch. But once they do, the process goes pretty quickly. The eggs hatch into something called larvae, which you might have seen if you've ever seen any stagnant water out in a bird bath or in a piece of trash, on the side of the road or, in your yard. These larvae are very small and they kind of wiggle around like this. They're really fun to watch. They're pretty active. But those larvae are going to exist like that for only a couple of days, maybe about 5 days or so, before they turn into what's called a pupa. And a pupa is a pretty common stage for most insects. It's the way that a lot of insects change shape. It's actually pretty similar to how caterpillars turn into butterflies. The terminology can be a little bit different, but they start off as something sort of wiggly, and then they get a case around them, and then they become an adult flying insect. The same is true for mosquitoes as it is for butterflies, and it's true for a lot of other things. So those mosquitoes are going to be in a pupa for, again, just a couple of days, about 2 to 3 days, and then they will grow into that adult mosquito, and the whole process starts all over again. Now, this is really interesting too, because it means that from one adult mosquito, of course, that mosquito can lay a lot of eggs, which hatch into a lot of larvae, which hatch into a lot of pupa, which then become a lot of adult mosquitoes in the course of a couple of weeks, which is why mosquito populations seem to explode almost out of nowhere after it rains, because those eggs go through that process so quickly. It is important to know as well, the fact that mosquitoes want to drink our blood for this process is annoying, but for some species, it's absolutely harmless. Like I've seen a couple of different people here that say that they actually don't mind if mosquitoes are biting them, just so long as they don't have to hear the buzzing, they don't have to feel the itching. And I feel that exact same way for most species of mosquito. So there's actually, right here in Michigan, there are 55 different species of mosquito, and most of them, this is all they do. They'll drink some blood, they'll lay some eggs. Mostly they drink nectar and fruit juice. They don't really bother anybody. They're a great food source for bats, and they just kind of go about their business. But there are several species of mosquito that can actually be pretty dangerous for humans and for other animals. And we're going to touch on that a little bit right now, because those mosquitoes, unfortunately, are really great at spreading disease. So like I said, there are 55 species of mosquito in Michigan. Only a few spread disease. But it's really easy for that disease to spread because of the way the mosquitoes drink blood. And this system makes a lot of sense when you think about it. So if you think of the mosquito almost like a big straw, if you guys have ever been at a restaurant, you stuck your straw in a glass of water, if you put your finger over the top and you lift up the straw, all of the liquid in the straw actually stays in there because of the capillary action and because of just the way that the pressure is working inside the straw. And mosquitoes work actually pretty similar to that. So when a mosquito drinks blood, it obviously is going to be full of blood from you, but there's also going to be a little bit of blood and whatever was in the blood inside the proboscis and just inside the whole body cavity of the mosquito. So when the mosquito goes to fly to another person and bites them, sometimes a little bit of that liquid will get spewed out of the mosquito back into the next person. And this person, can be someone that if the mosquito bit me, it can be a person I've never met before. It can be a person, miles away from me. So it's a disease vector, we call it. It's a way the disease can spread. We've heard a lot about disease vectors, a lot about disease recently, of course, with COVID. And there are a lot of diseases that can spread this way through the blood. We'll talk about a couple of them. But there are also a lot of diseases that don't spread this way. So for instance, I was speaking with somebody just before this program about something that they'd seen on Facebook that said that mosquitoes could spread COVID. That's not how COVID spreads. Mosquitoes cannot spread COVID. COVID is spread through respiratory droplets, which is a different way to spread disease as opposed to a mosquito biting you and bringing that blood to the next person. So we're only going to be talking about a few diseases here. This is not true for all disease. But in Michigan, there are some diseases that spread this way. One of them is West Nile virus. That's something that we've probably heard of for a while now in Michigan. It's been around for a while. Another one that's appeared more recently is Eastern equine encephalitis. And there's also Jamestown Canyon virus that spreads in Michigan through mosquitoes. But there are also a lot of other diseases worldwide that are actually a much bigger deal that spread through mosquitoes. So those are things like malaria, dengue fever, yellow fever, Zika. These are all diseases that can be spread through these mechanisms. And we're going to talk about the most serious one right now, which is malaria. And malaria is a very big problem. I'm pulling up a data set here now that is from the Malaria Atlas Project. And before I talk about it, I just want to introduce the idea of malaria a little bit. It is an absolutely huge problem. I'm sure that you have heard of malaria before, but if you're like me, I honestly didn't realize just how big of a problem it was for quite a while. In 2017, 435,000 people died of malaria. That's almost 500,000 people in just that 1 year. And millions of people become sick with malaria every year. People with malaria often experience flu-like symptoms, includes fever and chills. And it's important to note that also, according to the CDC, nearly half the world's population is at risk of contracting malaria. So it is a big deal. It is all over the place in the world, and it is constantly being spread by mosquitoes. In 2010, we talked about 2017 a second ago. In 2010, there was an estimated 219 million cases of malaria, and 91% of the deadly cases were in Africa. So it is a very, very big deal. Looking at this map specifically, this is data from 2010 looking at the potential spread of malaria. I say the potential spread because it is so hard to track the total number of cases of malaria because mosquitoes are so prevalent and it is just so prevalent in the world. So if we're looking at this map, it's actually looking at probability and percentage rather than actual numbers. So if you're looking at this map and you see an area that says 20%, for instance, that means that there is a 20% chance that someone in that area of the map contracted malaria in 2010 because the numbers are just too staggering to be able to track. And someone in the comments says here, malaria killed more people than any other disease in history. I don't have a source on that, but I would absolutely believe that, and that's exactly how dangerous of a disease it is. It is important to note, though, that even though mosquitoes are the vector for this disease, they don't cause the disease themselves. So malaria is actually caused by a parasite, and that parasite is called Plasmodium falciparum. And there are several other types of malaria parasite, but Plasmodium falciparum is the most dangerous. And this map is looking only at that one species of parasite. There are 4 more types of parasites of human transferable malaria that we could be looking at. So it's incredibly widespread. It's important to note as well, like I said, it's really hard to track the number of cases of malaria. So this map is also looking at something that's called environmental covariates, which is basically a fancy way of saying what other ways can we figure out how malaria is spreading. So it looks at things like rainfall, temperature, land cover, and whether an area is urban or rural. Finally, before we stop talking about malaria, there is one other important thing to mention, and that is that it is an entirely preventable disease. It has killed more people than any other disease in history, like we heard in the comments. It's incredibly prolific, but if you have basic care against mosquitoes, if we're able to get mosquito nets and bug spray and able to treat malaria and get resources to the areas that it is affecting in the world, malaria could 100% be taken out of the world. It takes a lot of effort, but it is something that people are actively trying to do. There is one other thing that we're going to talk about today in terms of tropical disease, and that is how mosquitoes are changing with climate change and how that affects the spread of tropical disease. So this data set that I pulled up right now is showing the average boundary of the tropics and showing something that's called tropical widening. So when we talk about the tropics, they are going to be the area on the sphere here that is colored orange. You can see it's a big band across the middle. And usually the tropics are defined by a number of different things. So one of those things, how we define the tropics, is their latitude, or where they're located on the Earth. Tropics are also figured out by precipitation, how much rainfall they get, and also winds that blow through the area. But like I mentioned, the area of the tropics is getting wider as the climate is changing. In the past 30 years, we can see there's sort of two boundaries on here. 1980 to 1984 is the blue line that shows what the boundary of the tropics was in that 4-year period. And then 30 years later, looking at that 2008 to 2012 is the red line. And we can see that the tropics have actually gotten 12 degrees wider, 10 degrees wider in that 30-year period. And this is really significant because the tropics are a great place for mosquitoes to live. We talked about mosquitoes needing that area of water in order for them to lay their eggs. Mosquitoes really like it to be warm in order to reproduce year round. And the tropics are a great place for them to do that. So the fact that the tropics are widening means that there is more mosquito habitat for those mosquitoes to flourish in. But even just having more mosquito habitat isn't the end of the story. We also have to think about the areas on the edges of the tropics here, and those areas are called the subtropics. And the subtropics tend on average to be a little bit drier, a little bit more arid than the tropics do. And that makes sense when you think about it. If you look at the areas that are in the subtropics, that's looking at like the southwestern United States, that's looking at southern Australia, the middle of Australia. These are all areas that are usually pretty dry. And there have been studies that show that mosquitoes are actually more likely to drink blood than other food sources in dry areas. So as these tropics expand, the subtropics are expanding as well, which means that mosquitoes who are potentially spreading disease are spreading further north and further south, causing more tropical diseases to spread throughout the world, which is great for tropical disease, but not great for humans. But luckily, there are some things that we can do to help stop this spread. The main things are personal protection. So if you are going to be going out in your yard, if you're doing yard work, I know it's the end of the summer now, but it's still mosquito season. It's always good to remember. You can always wear long pants and long sleeves. That's going to deter any mosquitoes from trying to bite you. You can also wear EPA approved bug spray. Highly recommend that anytime you're going outside right now. If you're going to be inside working, I know that there's days like today where it's a little bit warm. If your windows or doors are open, you have to make sure that they have screens in them and that those screens are small enough that those mosquitoes are not able to get through. And if you can avoid being outside in the evening hours, that will help. And of course, if you're not as concerned about your personal protection, but more concerned about community protection, there are lots of things you can do as well. So things like cleaning up your yard. If you have any waste in your yard, any trash or any old bird baths that could be collecting water, it's really important to clean up that trash because it can collect water, which lets mosquitoes lay their eggs. It's also important to empty out those bird baths and bird feeders every time it rains because again, those hold water, which lets mosquitoes reproduce. Finally, you can also install bat houses around your yard. Bats are a fantastic mosquito control. If you're interested in more information about how to bring bats to your yard, there's actually a club for that at MSU called the Bat Association of MSU. You can feel free to look them up and learn more information about how you can attract bats and other mosquito predators to your area. But with that, I see also we have some questions in the chat. So I might go through some of those and answer those questions. And if you guys do have any more questions about mosquitoes or about things you can do to protect yourself, feel free to type those in. We'll go through some of the chat and then, answer those questions as much as we can. So Stephanie, if you wouldn't mind checking on Facebook, I can start with some of the questions on Zoom. So it looks like somebody has a question that says, does a just mowed lawn limit mosquito population growth? That is a great question. And I'll be honest, I do not know the answer. Anecdotally, I've definitely seen that in my yard, that every time I have really long grass, mosquitoes tend to flourish. And when I cut the grass, it tends not to be as high of a mosquito population, but I don't know whether that is, like I said, just anecdotal, something I've noticed, or whether that's actually something that stops the mosquitoes from spreading. I do note that having a lot of native plants, having long grasses, and having just more of a wild ecosystem in your yard is better for bugs. It is a great place for bugs to flourish, which would include mosquitoes. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's true. Mowing your lawn would limit mosquito population growth, but I don't know for sure whether or not it is. Let's see, and then I see Anne has said she added a little bit of information about how mosquitoes spread disease, which is fantastic. Thank you, Anne. So Anne brought up the fact that mosquitoes don't just leave residue on the process, but that they actually will be sucking up blood and then they spit things back out into the body, which is absolutely true. So some parasites, when they're being spread by mosquitoes, will sit in the salivary glands and exit when the mosquito is feeding. And so that's a really fantastic little thing from Anne there. I appreciate that. Yeah, there's all sorts of different ways that diseases can spread. And so it depends species to species, parasite to parasite, virus to virus, how it spreads in different mosquitoes. But yeah, there's all sorts of interesting ways that they can happen. I see Cassie here says, if I add a few guppies to my contained pond in efforts to control the larvae, am I doing more harm? I figure the snapper will eat the fish or maybe the cold will. That is a great question, Cassie. Yeah, so one thing that you can do if you've got a body of water and you want to prevent mosquitoes from laying their eggs in it is just making sure that that body of water is active. So you could add some sort of predator that would eat the mosquito larvae. That could totally work. But you could also add something that's going to sort of make the water move around. So if you were to add some sort of like fountain, some sort of water feature, just some way to get that water flowing. Mosquitoes don't like laying their eggs in flowing water very much. So hopefully that would prevent the larvae from entering your pond in the first place. I see someone else says, I think it's also Cassie, that they've noticed the bat population has shrunk in Southeast Michigan. There are very few this summer. Yeah, so this program obviously is not about bats, but it can be tangentially because bats are a mosquito predator. Bats are facing a lot of issues right now. There's a lot of different diseases that bats can get, and also they're losing habitat. So yeah, it's fantastic to help out bats on your property to help mosquito control, but also just because bats need a little bit of a boost in our area and all around. And then I see Michelle also has a question that says, why are mosquitoes vectors? How are they not infected also? That is a fantastic question, Michelle. So the reason that mosquitoes are not infected by disease as well is just because mosquitoes have a very different biology from humans. Right? So diseases affect humans. We can even use COVID as an example that, diseases affect us. Sometimes they can be spread between different species. Sometimes species can be carriers of disease, but disease does not affect every single species the exact same way. So if we're thinking about malaria, for instance, and the fact that the malaria disease is caused by a parasite, that parasite is going to affect us as humans. But just the same way that mosquitoes have a life cycle, so does that parasite. That parasite also has a life cycle. And part of that parasite's life cycle is being sucked up by a mosquito and brought into another human. So the mosquitoes are technically infected. They are carrying the malaria parasite, but it's important to that parasite that that mosquito stays alive, because that is the way that the parasite is able to reproduce, is by using the mosquito basically like a taxi to get to its next host. So the parasite wouldn't want to kill the mosquito, it wouldn't want to affect the mosquito in the same way, because that would stop the parasite's life cycle right in its tracks. So yeah, they technically are infected with the parasite, but they're not, or I guess they're carrying the parasite, but they're not actually seeing those same effects that we have. Yeah, and I see Pia has linked to the CDC website all about mosquitoes, which is absolutely fantastic. The CDC, of course, we are familiar, has a lot of different great resources about all sorts of diseases, but they really have a really fantastic mosquito section to their website, all about mosquito-borne diseases, ways you can prevent mosquito-borne disease, and I got most of the information from this presentation from that website. So I'm really glad you linked to that, Pia. Stephanie, do we have any questions on Facebook, or any questions that I am not seeing?
So other than food for bats, what useful purpose do mosquitoes serve?
That is a great question. And I am going to push you guys a little bit on this because I also thought this way for a long time about, what is the purpose of a mosquito other than, food for bats. But that's actually the wrong question to be asking. So we as humans use nature for a lot of different purposes, right? So, I mean, some of us eat meat, some of us eat plants. We use plants for medicine. We have all sorts of different relationships with nature. But we tend to think of nature, even if we don't think of that immediately in our brains, we tend to think of nature as a commodity that has to have a purpose, right? So mosquitoes don't necessarily serve a purpose, but that's because nothing in nature really serves a purpose. Mosquitoes exist. They evolved to have a lifestyle that suits them, so they're able to survive and reproduce. But they don't necessarily have a role in the ecosystem that we understand because not everything has to, There's an idea when we talk about nature that, everything fits perfectly into this cycle, everyone fits perfectly into this dome. But that's not necessarily the way that nature really works. It's just the way that we understand it. So species don't necessarily have to serve a purpose other than their own purposes to survive, right? I don't know if that helped answer the question. I think it's hard because you have to have kind of a shift in your brain about the way that you think about animals and plants and nature. We're so used to the idea that, we don't want to get rid of big predators, for instance, because they keep small populations of herbivores in check. And we don't want to pollute our rivers because that means that the fish don't survive. But ultimately, all of that relates to humans. And that's how we experience nature. It all relates to the way that we interact with nature, ultimately at the very, very top. But when you realize that, mosquitoes exist because they are able to and because they found a niche that works for them, that's really all the purpose that they have to serve. That being said, if we were to get rid of all of the mosquitoes, that's kind of the natural next question to this, is that if mosquitoes don't serve a purpose, so to speak, they're not pollinators, but some mosquitoes are pollinators. If they're bat food, which obviously they are a great source of food for animals, what would happen if we were to get rid of all the mosquitoes? And there have been some studies done on this just because, like I said, mosquitoes are sort of a universal pest. And it's thought that specifically the disease spreading mosquitoes, if we were to get rid of some of those species, it might not have a huge impact on the environment, but we also don't know that for certain. And we wouldn't know that until it happened because we're constantly learning more things about nature. We're constantly learning more things about these complex systems. So it's a really fantastic question to ask about sort of what purpose do they serve? But ultimately they just serve the purpose of making the world more diverse and more interesting, which I think is a good enough purpose for me anyway. So sorry, that was kind of a long and rambly answer, but that's what it is. Are there any other questions? Let's see. Oh, I see there are some questions in the Q&A here. So it says, Mosquito Squad is very popular in Lansing area. Could you please speak to the environmental impact? Yes. So this question is all about insecticide, using insecticide to control mosquitoes. And it's a really good question. It's a very complicated topic, mainly because insecticide is not great for insects. I mean, the whole idea of an insecticide is that it kills insects, right? So if we're trying to stop the spread of disease through mosquitoes, that's really great to use insecticide because it kills all the mosquitoes. It stops that disease cycle completely. But it also usually affects other species. So even if there's insecticide that is somehow super specific, that it doesn't affect pollinators, it doesn't affect other insects, which most of these insecticides actually do affect other insects. It still could affect other mosquitoes. And like we learned in this presentation, there are 55 species of mosquito in Michigan, and most of them are not harmful. Most of them don't spread disease. And so it is hard to recommend using insecticide in those cases. So I personally would recommend using natural solutions, using mosquito predators that we talked about. If you have a water supply, having some sort of fish or something in there that's going to eat the larvae, bringing bats to your yard. There also are some plants, and I don't know of any specifically off the top of my head, but there's a lot of resources about these. You can plant certain plants that will prevent mosquitoes from coming to your area because they don't like the way that they smell, the way that they feel. So there's ways to diminish the populations in your yard. And someone else says, I heard that some mosquitoes lay eggs where it is dry, but it will be wet someday, like around a pond or a bucket. Is that true? Again, that would not surprise me. I don't know for certain, but just based off the way that the mosquito life cycle works, we talked about those eggs being laid and being able to survive for quite a while. It wouldn't surprise me if certain species had that ability to lay eggs where it's dry, and just knowing that they're going to be wet later on. This person also says, I read Michigan used to be a hotbed of malaria before being drained and settled. That's an interesting one as well. I haven't heard that. I do know that Michigan used to be very, very swampy before European settlers came in certain areas. So it wouldn't surprise me if those mosquitoes were a lot more prevalent when Michigan was pretty swampy then. Yeah, I think those are all the questions that I see right here. And I don't know. Yes, so I see there are a couple of other ones in here that says other animals see mosquitoes too, like mosquito fish, for example. That is absolutely true. It's not just bats. Yeah, Stephanie, are there any other questions on Facebook that you can see, or any other observations?
I think we're good.
All right, cool. This was fantastic. I had a really great time talking about this. I hope that you guys had a good time as well. I'm not a mosquito expert, but I really enjoyed learning about it and talking about it for World Mosquito Day. If you guys do have any further questions about this, you can feel free to reach out to us at the museum. We'd be happy to point you in the right direction of some resources. This is the last Science on a Sphere program that we are doing for the summer. We had our Science on a Sphere summer series, and that wraps up with this program. But be sure to keep an eye out on our website and on our social media. Our website is museum.msu.edu, and our social media is all at MSU Museum for updates about upcoming programs and all sorts of cool stuff that we're going to be doing this fall. The main thing, of course, that we need to mention is that the museum is going to be reopening to the public this fall, this September, so right around the corner. And again, you can check that out on our website for more updates about how exactly that's going to work and all of the details about that as they become available. Hopefully, we're going to be very excited to see you all in person at the museum in September. Yeah, so I really appreciate everybody coming out, and I hope that you all have a fantastic rest of your days. All right.